So good afternoon. I will make a presentation on how to foster innovation-driven entrepreneurship in Korea. So I will first present a bit of data highlighting the strengths of the Korean economy and also some of the challenges it is facing, in particular regarding innovation, research and development, and the contribution of MSCs and SMEs. Okay, so first, if you look at the growth path of Korea, you can see that during the last 25 years, the growth rate of the Korean economy has been above the OECD average. So you have Korea in red here and the OECD in green, and it's quite clear that the country has been growing strongly during the last 25 years. This has enabled Korea to substantially increase its per capita income. In 1991, this per capita income represented only 39% of the top half of OECD average economies. And in 2014, it had increased to 75%, which is really an important increase, which is due to these high growth rates that the Korean economy has experienced during this period. If now I look at labor productivity, so that's the efficiency of labor, you can see that during the last 10 years, between 2005 and 2014, so 2014 is the last year for which we have data to compare, labor productivity has increased by 5% in the OECD area. In Korea, it has increased by 35%, which is a good performance. Where the country ranks quite high, and this will not be a surprise for you, is research and development investment. So if we look at Korea and we compare it to the average in the OECD region, what we can see, so an indicator that is considered as quite telling is the gross domestic expenditure on research and development, GERD. You can see that in, can I point to, yeah, but in 2014, it represented 4.29% of the Korean GDP. In the OECD, it was 2.38% of GDP, which means that the expenditure on research and development is almost twice in Korea than it is in OECD economies. Another important fact is that it's growing faster. So between 2009 and 2014, it had been growing at an annual rate of 6.9% against 2.3% in the OECD area, which is also substantial. If you look at the last part at the bottom, what you can see is also the share of publicly financed expenditure. And you can see that it's still higher in Korea than in the OECD, but what's important is that 101% is publicly financed, so if you compare it with the 429%, it means that you have 328%, which is funded by the private sector. So it's very high rates of research and development, strong expenditure in research and development, and which is mainly driven by investments made by the Korean companies. Here we look at the revealed technology advantage in selected fields between 2011 and 2013. So we can see that although it's a bit behind in terms of biotechnology, so we compare to the OECD on the one hand and the European Union on the other hand. So biotechnologies, Korea is a bit behind. It's kind of like other countries for environment-related technologies. But if you look at ICT, which is in the middle, so you have Korea in dark gray, you have the OECD in dark blue, and the EU in light blue, you can see that Korea is performing particularly well for ICT. However, and this is an important trend to look at when thinking about, the current years and the future, the potential GDP growth of the country has been falling sharply since 1990. So what is the potential GDP growth? So the potential GDP of an economy is the output this economy could produce if it used its whole capital, whole stock capital, its labor, and in view of its current labor efficiency. In Korea, this has been decreasing substantially. What is true is that labor productivity, as we have seen before, has been increasing a lot, but it remains below the OECD average. So you have Korea here in red, in the top graph, labor productivity, and you can see that the output per hour worked is, on this indicator, Korea is not really comparing well with other OECD economies, and although in terms of the number of hours worked per capita is quite high. So in Korea, people tend to work much more than in other OECD economies. However, unfortunately, the output per hour remains below the OECD average, although it has been growing a lot during the last 25 years. And this is particularly true for the SMEs. So if you look at the small and medium enterprises, this is where the country the companies are really not performing as well as in other OECD economies. So the labor productivity in SMEs tends to be, you have Korea in red here on the left, really lower than other OECD economies. Here, if we look at the human capital, so this is also an important factor an important determinant of growth in a country. And we are comparing Korea to its neighbor Japan, and then to two economies which are considered as strong entrepreneurial economies, the US and the UK. So these are countries where there is a strong entrepreneurial spirit. So we thought it could be good to compare the two countries. So what you can see is that Korea is performing really well in terms of research and development, whether, on the government side or in terms of the private sector. The tertiary enrollment by students is particularly high. I mean, it's 59% in the UK, 62% in Japan, 88% in the US, and 95% in Korea, which is an extremely high number when you compare it to the whole, all OECD countries. If you look at the graduates in science and technology, what you can see is that it's 20% in Japan, around 25% in the UK and the US, it's 32% in Korea, so here as well, quite high. The number of researchers per million is also particularly high. You have almost 7,000 researchers per million in Korea against around 4,000 in the US and the UK, and 5,000 in Japan. However, if you look at the employment in knowledge-intensive industries, you see that it's around 21% in Korea, while it's 24% in Japan, and around 40% in the US, 47% in the UK, which tells you that there is a very strong human capital, but that unfortunately does not necessarily feed into knowledge-intensive industries, and actually not all the human capital which is produced by the Korean education system can be used by the Korean economy. And then, so you have a series of indicators. I'm not going to go through all of them. And then at the bottom, I wanted to compare this with the startup rate. To avoid any misunderstanding, there is no linear relationship between, having strong research and development and business creation. But I just wanted to see how these economies compared in terms of creating businesses. And what you see is that Japan is really not performing very well at 9. Korea is doing better at 167, but if you compare it with the US and the UK, you can see that there is much more business creation in these two economies. And one of the things which is particularly striking is the fact that young entrepreneurs represent a lower share of the population than in other OECD economies. So here you have South Korea on the left, at the far left, and if you compare to the other countries, you can see that the young entrepreneurs represent a lower share of the youth population than in other economies. In the US, you have around 10% of the population which are entrepreneurs. It's the same rates for the youth, 10% of the youth are entrepreneurs. It's not even 1% of the youth which are entrepreneurs in South Korea. So why is that? Now I'll try to see what are the reasons for this situation, and I will do this by looking at the business conditions for the SMEs and the MSCs in Korea. So I will base my analysis on an analysis which is in a report that the OECD launched last May, which is called Small, Medium, Strong, trends in SME performance and business conditions. It's available online, so if you're interested, you can find it on the OECD website. So what this report says and shows actually, it analyzes SMEs' performance across OECD countries and then look at the drivers of these differences in business creation and SME performance. And it does so along 4 important dimensions. So first, institutional and regulatory framework, the regulation, the governance. Is there a framework which enables business creation and which enables SMEs to perform? Then access to markets. If I want to create a business or if I am an SME, will I have access to markets in Korea and outside Korea? Access to resources is very important. Access to finance, access to energy, access to human capital. And finally, the culture, the entrepreneurial culture. What are the attitudes of the society vis-à-vis entrepreneurship? Are there opportunities to start businesses, and do I have the proper capabilities? So we will look at how Korea ranks along these 4 dimensions to try to identify what may explain what we have seen in the previous slides. So first, the institutional and regulatory framework. The cost to start a business is particularly high in Korea. So these graphs are not the easiest to read, but they kind of compare. So at the top, you have the top 25% among OECD economies. At the bottom, you have the bottom 25%, so that's where you don't perform very well compared to the other OECD economies. For those who need it, you can have translation, so please feel free to use the translation. And then you have the economies which are in between 25 and 75%. And when you look at the cost to start a business, the Korea is at the frontier of the bottom 25%, and the cost is particularly high. Then if you look at the number of regulations, since the crisis in 2008, there has been a sharp increase in the number of regulations, and this affects particularly SMEs, because large companies, they don't like regulations, they will complain about regulations, but they have enough resources to deal with these regulations, and the cost of doing this is lower for them than it is for SMEs or MSEs. If we look at the product market regulation in particular, so here you have Korea in red. And if you look at the left, you can see that at the bottom is the less restrictive, and at the top is the most restrictive. So it's a particularly restrictive product market regulation. Access to markets, here you can see is at the far left that there are strong barriers to trade and investment. Here Korea ranks at the bottom 25% among OECD economies. And in terms of access to resources, so this is an important point because the Korean government has strongly supported and is still strongly supporting the SMEs in terms of access to finance. And we will see this in the next 2 slides. And now it's supporting as well the MSCs. And the venture capital investment in particular has been increasing substantially since 2011. Here we can see that it's among the highest among OECD countries. So if you look on the left, you have in blue Korea. And the only countries which are doing better are Israel, the USA, Canada, and Sweden. So Korea ranks number 5 in terms of the share of venture capital in total GDP. However, if you look at the type of companies which are funded by these venture capital investments, you see that there is an important share of companies which are older than 7 years, so they're more than 7 years old. And venture capital is risk capital, so it's particularly well suited for companies which are new and which are also generally in risky fields. When you are more than 7 years old, normally you have access to other types of capital, like growth capital from private equity firms, and you may also have access to various types of loans. So it is possible that while there has been a strong investment in venture capital, it could have been more focused on the companies which needed the most, that is the new companies in risky sectors, the ones which are between 0 and 3 years old, or perhaps just a bit above 3 years old, between 3 and 7, instead of having the largest share of this capital going to companies which are more than 7 years old. If we look at the share of SMEs in research and development expenditure. So we saw that Korea is very strong in research and development. This is not a surprise for you, but the figures are particularly high. However, if you look at the second blue line here, you see that in Korea, the share of the contribution of SMEs to this expenditure and research and development is in the bottom 25% of the OECD. So the SMEs are not really contributing to research and development as much as they are in the other OECD economies. And this is mainly due, so here you have Korea on the right. This is mainly due to its low share in privately funded research, expenditure for research and development. So on the side of the government sector, there is a more substantial share of SMEs, but for the expenditure which is funded by the private sector, it tends not to be really on the SME side. The culture is extremely important. This is something which was discussed this morning, repeatedly, which is that it's important that entrepreneurship, starting a business, growing a business, is viewed positively by society for people to want to start a business and to innovate and to grow. And when you ask people, if they have a favorable image of entrepreneurs, here you have Korea in red on the left, and you can see that you have just a bit more than 30% of people in Korea who have answered yes, we have a favorable image of entrepreneurs, whereas you have numerous countries on the right where this share is above 50% and can be particularly high. So here, if we look also at other dimensions in the culture, what we see is that when asked, why is this? Why do you not see, entrepreneurship as something positive? People say that there are not that many opportunities, so there is a perception of lack of opportunities. And then on the right, you have training. So Koreans also feel that if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you want to start a business, if you want to grow a business, you don't have access to suitable training. So what can the country do now to translate its strong investments in research and development into innovation-driven entrepreneurship? So the creation of a Ministry of SMEs and Startups would be a very strong signal sent, to the whole economy, that startups and SMEs and MSCs are very important for the Korean economy, can potentially contribute strongly to growth and to job creation. There has been also a Young Entrepreneurs Startup Academy, so this can help, young entrepreneurs start, because they can have support in terms of funding, they can have support in terms of skills, which is also particularly important, they can have support in terms of access to networks. And there was also a youth development fund, which aimed at also bringing more entrepreneurship among youth in Korea. The other things that Korea could do could be to draw on the initiatives which were implemented in other countries. So for example, in terms of reducing the regulatory burden, trying not to have too much regulation so that it's not so difficult and so expensive to start a business. You can look at the one-to-one rule, for example, in Canada or in the United Kingdom. So in Canada, it's kind of strict because each time there is a new regulation which increases the burden, the regulatory burden, one other regulation has to disappear. So you cannot have one new regulation which means more work for SMEs if you don't suppress another one. And in the UK, there must be an assessment of the cost to comply for any new regulation for SMEs. So, which means that the regulators, they must always keep in mind that it may be difficult for SMEs to comply with the regulation, so that they take this into account. If we look at the culture, so how can you do to promote an entrepreneurial culture? You can see that lots of countries at the top have taken a number of initiatives in terms of entrepreneurship education. So having foundations for entrepreneurship, the European Commission support for entrepreneurship education. So lots of programs to try to have proper education so that people have the skills to start businesses. And also coaching and mentoring, because it's not only, you know, there is often a strong aspect on finance, providing finance, but you also need to have the skills. And so it's having access to the right courses, but also having access to the right people, having possibilities to interact with people who have successfully started a business and can, you know, explain to you what are the challenges, what are the risks, and what are the mistakes that you may want to avoid. So thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.